Before I tell you what happened, just remember, some graves aren't meant to stay closed. I was the one who noticed the grave sinking, but I kept my mouth shut for 3 days because I didn't want to give the older groundskeeper the satisfaction of being right about restless plots. It started as a subtle dip in the earth, just a shallow bowl in the fresh soil over an older grave we hadn't touched in years. A grave with a headstone so worn that only the first name, Ely, and the year 1893 were still clear. At first I assumed it was normal settling. Cemeteries are full of quiet movements, roots reclaiming wood, coffins collapsing in on themselves, burrowing animals threading tunnels under the dead. But by the third night, the depression had deepened into a distinct hollow, like something heavy was slowly pulling the earth down from beneath. We had a flood in the lower section earlier that month, so I decided to chalk it up to drainage issues, even though this plot sat on higher ground. Beneath one of the old iron crosses that overlooked the rest of the cemetery. That evening the wind was barely moving, the trees around the perimeter just whispering against the stone. And I remembered the chill that ran through me when I realized that every other grave in that row was perfectly level. Only Ely's grave sagged like a lung, exhaling. I was alone that night. The older groundskeeper Petru had broken his wrist and was home, calling me every few hours to ask if the candles at the newer section were still burning and if any stray dogs had slipped through the fence. I lied and told him everything was fine. I didn't mention the sinking grave or the strange feeling that had settled in my chest when I walked past it, that sensation of having gone down one too many steps in the dark and never quite finding the floor. I tried to ignore it for another hour, pretending to work in the chapel, sorting through wilted flowers for the compost pile. But my eyes kept drifting to the window, to that one crooked shape among all the smooth mounds. Eventually, annoyance beat fear. I grabbed a shovel, a lantern, and the small metal probe we used to check depth, and headed toward the plot. The sky had that washed-out, colorless look right before full dark, and the air smelled like damp stone and extinguished candles. As I approached, the hollow looked worse up close, like a mouth open in a silent scream. When I stepped near the edge, the soil gave a little under my boot, not crumbling, not collapsing, just sinking, as if compacting around nothing at all. I told myself it was just a void under the coffin lid, and I could fix it with more soil. I set the lantern down on the headstone, the warm light spilling over the cracked marble letters, and drove the probe straight down into the center of the sunken spot. The metal slid through the earth too easily. I was expecting resistance at about 2 meters, where the coffin should be, but the rod kept going deeper, deeper, until I had my fist wrapped around the very end, and the tip had still met nothing solid. No dull thud of wood, no scrape of stone, just emptiness. A cold draft of air brushed up along the metal and kissed my fingers, faint but unmistakable, as if the earth itself had exhaled into my hand. I pulled the probe out so fast I nearly dropped it. The metal was colder than it had any right to be, slick with moisture despite the dry soil. That was my first chance to walk away, to fill the hollow with extra dirt, write it off as some strange geological quirk, and pretend the grave had never sunk at all. Instead, I set my jaw, stabbed the shovel into the loosened soil, and started to dig. The ground practically welcomed the blade, parting with too little resistance. I went down half a meter, then a full meter, expecting at any moment to expose the top of an old coffin, or at least hit a rock. The lantern's glow shrank as the hole deepened, its light struggling to reach my boots. The air grew cooler with each shovelful I tossed aside, and with it came a smell that wasn't quite rot, not yet, but old, stale, mineral, like a cellar sealed for generations. When I was deep enough that the edge of the hole reached my thigh, the soil beneath my shovel gave way with a soft, sickening crumble, and the blade punched through into empty space. The ground under my feet sagged but didn't collapse. It just seemed to deflate, letting a rush of cold air surge up around my legs. I froze, heart hammering, and slowly crouched down, scraping away the last layer of dirt with my gloved hands. That was when I saw it. Wood where there should have been a coffin, but not the smooth curve of a lid. It was flat and horizontal, set deeper than any coffin we'd ever buried here. Made of dark, old planks pressed close together. Iron rings, black with age, were bolted into two of the boards, like the handles of a cellar door. Someone had built a door under the grave. I stared at it, breathing shallowly, trying to rationalize. Maybe there'd been an older crypt here, long forgotten. Maybe the records were wrong, but the door didn't feel like any part of the cemetery I knew. It felt older, deliberate, like the grave above had been chosen to hide it. I brushed away more dirt until both rings were clean, my fingers shaking despite the gloves. The air leaking from between the boards was colder now, tinged with something organic and stale. I forced myself to lean down until my ear was near one of the seams. At first I heard nothing but the blood pounding in my head and the faint, steady tick of the lantern behind me. Then I realized the ticking wasn't the lantern at all. It was coming from below, slow, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone tapping a fingernail against wood, patient and precise. 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 again. Tap, tap, tap. I jerked back, every instinct screaming at me to fill the hole and walk away, but the sound followed me in the air, vibrating through the wood into my bones. Before I could think better of it, I reached out and laid my palm flat on one of the planks, right above where the tapping seemed strongest. It stopped immediately. For a second, there was only silence. Then, right beneath my hand, something tapped back, copying the exact rhythm of my own heartbeat. My pulse spiked and the tapping sped up with it, mirroring it perfectly, like a second heart buried in the darkness, pounding in sync with mine. I tore my hand away, stumbled backward, and nearly fell against the wall of the hole. The tapping stopped. The air was suddenly too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, waiting to be broken. I should have left. I know that now. Instead, I grabbed both iron rings with shaking hands and pulled. At first, the door resisted, stuck by time and earth, but something gave with a wet, tearing sound from the packed soil along the edges, like roots being ripped free. Cold air burst up from the crack as the boards shifted, slapping my face with the scent of long stagnant air and faint, sour decay. The door lifted just enough for a thin black mouth of space to appear. The lantern behind me flickered as if a draft had reached it from that narrow gap, and for a heartbeat the shadows around the grave stretched inward, leaning toward the opening. I swallowed hard, wedged my shoulders under one side of the door and heaved. It rose higher with a groan, earth crumbling away from the edges in fat clumps, revealing a square opening big enough for a person to climb through. A set of stone steps disappeared into the darkness below, slick and narrow, chewed by time. I stood on the edge, looking down, the lantern's glow barely licking the first few steps, leaving the rest swallowed in black. The air rising from below now was colder than the night around me, carrying a faint whisper of something metallic, like old blood and rust. I should have gone back for help, but the thought of calling Petro and trying to explain that there was a secret door under a grave, that something beneath it had tapped along with my heart, felt impossibly stupid and impossibly real at the same time. And there was a pull, a terrible, quiet compulsion, like the open dark was a question that had been waiting for someone to notice it for a very long time. I grabbed the lantern, took a deep breath, and descended. The second my foot touched the first step, the tapping resumed from somewhere below, much further down now, muffled but distinct like a greeting. The stone was slick with condensation, forcing me to brace one hand against the wall as I walked. The staircase turned after a few meters, twisting in a slow, tight spiral that left the grave and the night above feeling impossibly distant after only a dozen steps. The walls were cut from the same pale stone as some of our older tombs, but here they were gouged with markings I didn't recognize. Not crosses or names, not symbols I'd seen in any church or on any gravestone. These were deeper, more jagged, carved with fury or ritual obsession. Circles intersected by straight lines, eyes without pupils, hands without fingers. Some were filled in with something dark that the lantern light made shine dully, as if they'd been smeared with old, dried something. Ink, I told myself at first. Ink was easier to think than blood. The air grew heavier as I descended, pressing against my chest. My breath smoked in front of my face, even though it wasn't that cold outside. The tapping continued, accelerating and slowing according to some rhythm I couldn't understand, sometimes moving closer, sometimes sounding far away, as if whatever made it was pacing in a larger space. Ahead, my mind tried to latch onto ordinary explanations. An animal caught below, scraping, a leak of water hitting stone. But the pattern was too deliberate, too aware. After 15 or 20 steps, my lantern finally threw its light into a wider chamber. The staircase ended on a floor of rough-hewn stone, its surface worn smooth in the center by countless feet, though there was no dust. The room itself was circular, maybe 8 or 9 meters across, the ceiling just high enough that I could comfortably stand. The walls were lined with shallow alcoves, each holding what I first thought were statues. Figures stood with their backs pressed into the stone, robed in garments carved from the same pale rock, their faces smooth and featureless. Then the lantern light shifted, and I saw that the robes weren't stone. They were real fabric, old but intact, hanging in heavy, dustless folds. The faces weren't carved, they were covered. Each figure's head was wrapped in a tight gray material that had darkened with age, compressed flat against the contours of skulls. Where their mouths should have been, the cloth was stitched shut over and over, in thread blacker than the shadows around us. There must have been a dozen of them, forming a ring around the room, all facing inward toward the center, where a low stone slab sat, stained in layers with something darker than the stone itself. Above the slab, carved directly into the ceiling, was the same circle and line symbol I'd seen on the stairwell, only larger, the grooves deeper, as if chisels had worried at it for years. The tapping had stopped the moment I stepped into the chamber. The silence that followed was different from the silence above, heavier, saturated. It felt like walking into a room where people had just been talking and gone quiet together, listening. My lantern flame flickered, as if a breath had passed over it, though the air was still. I turned slowly, every muscle in my back tight, expecting one of the wrapped figures to move, to turn its head. None did. They just stood, pressed into their alcoves, bound faces angled slightly downward in what could have been reverence or shame. "Hello!" My voice came out hoarse and too loud in the round room, bouncing back to me with a strange flatness. I don't know why I said it. Maybe some part of me still hoped there was another living person down here, an explanation that didn't involve whatever my gut already knew was wrong. The only answer was the soft hiss of my own breathing and the faint, steady buzz of the lantern flame. Then, behind me, something exhaled. It wasn't the gentle human sigh of lungs. It was deeper, heavier, a rush of air forced through a space that hadn't been used in a long, long time, carrying with it a smell like old bones cracked open and hollowed. The hair on the back of my neck rose so sharply it hurt. I turned slowly, raising the lantern, its trembling light dragging across the stone slab, across the stains, across the carved symbol on the ceiling until it landed on the far wall directly opposite the stairs. There, between two of the bound figures, the stone itself seemed to bulge, as if something enormous had pressed its weight from the other side for years. The carvings around that swell were deeper, more frenzied, long straight gouges that radiated outward like cracks around an impact. As I watched, the stone bulge pulsed. It expanded by a fraction, then relaxed like a muscle clenching. The sound that followed was not a tap this time. It was a low, grinding scrape, as if something with far too many joints was unfolding itself from a space it had long outgrown. The bulging section of wall split down the center, a nearly invisible seam widening as stone shifted against stone with a teeth-hurting squeal. Pale dust drifted down in a thin curtain, and from the darkness beyond the crack, something long and gray reached out. For a moment my mind refused to categorize it. It wasn't an arm, not exactly. It was too thin, the joints wrong, each angle too sharp and too many. The skin, or what passed for it, was the same color as the stone, stretched tight over ridges that might have been bone or might have been carved. Symbols like those on the walls were etched directly into it, but not in ink or blood. They were scars, raised and pale, a lattice of circles and lines that glowed faintly when the lantern light struck them. The limb bent in 3 places at once as it groped forward. Fingers. They were fingers, unfolding at the end like petals, each tipped with something that wasn't quite claw and wasn't quite nail. The air temperature dropped instantly, a biting cold that made the lantern sputter. My breath exploded in white puffs. The thing's reaching appendage brushed against the nearest bound. Figure's shoulder, and for an instant the wrapped head snapped upward beneath its bindings, the cloth straining just enough to show the suggestion of a mouth opening behind it, the stitches stretching tight. A muffled sound escaped, a choked, smothered gasp that made bile surge up my throat. The gray limb recoiled from the touch as if burned and then swung toward me. I didn't think. I ran. My body moved before any plan formed in my head, hurling me back toward the staircase. Behind me, the thing moved more fully through the split in the wall. I heard the sound of stone cracking and falling, the sickening slide of too many limbs scraping against rock. The tapping started again, but it wasn't beneath my feet anymore. It was all around me, a rattling, pulsing staccato that matched the wild hammering of my heart, echoing off every surface, as if the chamber itself had started to beat. I hit the first step and nearly slipped, hands slamming against the wall for balance. The stone felt like ice, burning my palms. I forced my legs to move, taking the steps 2 at a time, the lantern swinging wildly. Shadows hurled themselves along the walls, stretching, snapping, distorting. Halfway up, a blurred, elongated shape surged at the edge of my vision, something tall and thin that seemed to fill the entire stairwell behind me for a heartbeat. A chill pressure slid along my back, not quite a touch, more like the idea of one, brushing the surface of my mind the way its limb had brushed that wrapped figure. My thoughts stuttered, images slamming into my skull, graves yawning open, bodies stitched into walls, candles snuffed out all at once. My knees almost buckled. From somewhere below, close enough now that the sound split and doubled in the narrow space, I heard a new noise, a grinding almost like words forced through an unused throat. Not language I recognized, but structured enough that my brain tried to interpret it, and that effort made something inside me feel like it was tearing. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood, using the pain as an anchor, and threw myself upward faster. The lantern banged against the wall, glass cracking, but somehow the flame held. Above, a faint square of orange light appeared. The open door under the grave, the lantern I'd left up top flickering alone in the night. That distant glow became everything. The only point of reality in a world that had shrunk to the scrape of my boots, the burning in my lungs. and the cold awareness that something impossibly old and wrong was following just close enough to touch me if it chose. When my hands finally closed on the edge of the opening, I didn't bother with dignity. I hauled myself up onto the grass, elbows and ribs slamming into the packed earth. For a split second I was half in, half out of the grave, my legs still dangling into the dark below. That was when something wrapped around my ankle. It wasn't a full grip. It was more like a ring of cold pressure, a band of contact that circled my leg through the fabric of my pants with careful precision. Every muscle in my body locked. The tapping jumped into a manic, arrhythmic frenzy below, like a dozen hearts trying to synchronize and failing. My mind skidded toward the image of that limb, those scarred symbols brushing my skin, and I felt something press against me that wasn't physical at all. I weighed against my thoughts, testing, measuring. It felt like being looked at from the inside out. I don't know what saved me. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the age-ruined stones gave way beneath whatever had hold of me. Maybe it simply let go to see what I would do. The pressure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to understand why. I scrambled fully out of the hole, ignoring the pain in my leg, and grabbed the edge of the wooden door. It was heavier now, as if something below was bracing against it, resisting. I screamed, wordless, desperate, and shoved with every bit of strength panic gave me. The door slammed down with a thunderous crack that shook the soil, dust blooming around the edges. The moment it shut, the tapping cut off mid-beat, leaving only the night sounds of the cemetery, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint creak of metal from an old gate, my own ragged breathing. For a few seconds I could do nothing but sit there, half crouched over the sealed door, hands pressed to the splintered wood, waiting for it to crash open again, for that gray limb to burst through and drag me back down. Nothing happened. Slowly I eased off the boards and collapsed onto my back beside the grave, staring up at the sky. I'd been down there longer than I realized. The last smear of twilight was gone, replaced by a hard, brittle blackness punctured by a few dim stars. The lantern on the headstone beside me burned steadily, oblivious. The headstone itself, Eiley, 1893, watched my shaking form with its eroded, pitiless letters. When my pulse finally slowed enough that I could stand, my legs nearly gave out again. I forced myself to fill the hole. Every shovelful of dirt I threw onto the door felt like an apology and a betrayal. I packed the soil tight, tamping it down with my boots until the surface was as smooth as the surrounding graves. The knocking never resumed. No sound came from below, but as I worked, the sense of being observed didn't leave. It hovered at the edge of my awareness, a pressure just outside the limit of hearing, like someone whispering in another room where you can't make out the words. When I finished, the plot looked normal again. Too normal, like a body hastily hidden. I replaced the small iron fence that bordered the grave, straightened the crooked wooden Orthodox cross someone had stuck there years ago, and tried to steady my hands enough to light one of the thin wax candles from my pocket. The match flame shook wildly, guttering low, but the candle finally caught. I planted it in the soil above the door and stepped back. For a moment, everything was still. Then the candle flame bent sideways, not with the wind. It was too calm for that, but toward the headstone itself, as if drawn by something that stood between me and the name. The wax began to drip faster than it should have, running down in thin streams that pooled in a shape I couldn't quite make sense of, some rough circle crossed by a number of small broken lines. I snuffed it out with my fingers, heart hammering again, and turned away. I locked the cemetery gate that night with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. When Petru called to ask how things were, I told him it was quiet, that nothing strange had happened. I don't know why I lied. Maybe I was protecting him. Maybe I was protecting myself from hearing the story out loud. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was filled with dreams of narrow stone staircases, and stitched mouths straining against their bindings. I woke twice, certain that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, only to find my empty room watching me back. By the time my morning shift started, I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined at least some of it. That fear and darkness and isolation had twisted something ordinary into something monstrous. It was easier to believe that than to accept the alternative. That under one of the graves I tended, something older than the cemetery had been locked away, watched, and worshipped by people who'd given up their voices to keep it sleeping. At dawn, I walked straight back to Eileen's grave, more terrified of finding nothing than of finding evidence. The grass was wet with dew, the stones slick and gray, the world washed in that bluish light that makes everything look a little unreal. When I reached the plot, my stomach dropped. The soil was perfectly level. No sign of the hastily dug pit remained. The candle I'd left was gone, no wax on the earth, no burned-out stub. For a second I thought I'd lost my mind, that I had come to the wrong grave in the dark. Then I saw my shovel. It was lying exactly where I'd left it the night before, only now it rested neatly against the headstone instead of half buried in a heap of fresh soil. Someone had moved it. The iron fence around the grave gleamed faintly with moisture, but the small gate, which I was sure I'd left hanging crooked, was now latched with precise care. And in the thin layer of mud at the foot of the grave, clear and sharp and recent, I saw footprints, not mine. Mine were there too, a mess of crushed impressions from the night before, but these were different. They were longer, the bootprints narrower, the tread unfamiliar. They came from the direction of the older, overgrown section of the cemetery, stopped right at the head of the grave, turned in place, as if someone had stood there for a long time looking down, and then continued on toward the far wall, where the tangled trees pressed against the rusted fence. Those tracks ended abruptly at the boundary, but not at the gate. They stopped at a section of wall where the stone was darker from old water stains. The iron spikes bent slightly outward in one place, as if something tall and thin had stepped over instead of passing through. I stood there, staring at that spot, the chill of the staircase, and the chamber, and the grey limb crawling back into my veins. Whatever I'd woken up beneath that grave hadn't stayed there. It had followed the living air, climbed the same steps I did, walked through the rows of the dead like it belonged among them, and then left the same way the mourners did. Through the edges, through the places no one looked too closely at anymore. The grave was just a door. I was the one who opened it. And as I stood in that early light, listening to the distant sound of traffic and birds and the normal world creeping in around the edges of the cemetery, I realized something else. Something that made the small hairs along my arms stand up, even though the sun was finally rising. The tapping hadn't stopped when the door closed. It had only moved. My own heartbeat, steady but just a little too loud in my chest, echoed like something knocking from the inside, counting the days until I saw those footprints again, somewhere that wasn't the cemetery. I thought it ended when I shut that door and watched the soil settle. But last night, I heard the tapping again, and it wasn't coming from the cemetery.